She's quite an important person within the Trade and Agriculture Commission now in the UK. There's not a lot that Catherine doesn't know about the economic relationship between the UK and Australia, and indeed other territories too. And so I invited Catherine to talk to us all about her views on rebooting the UK-Australia relationship, which I'm hoping everybody's going to find very interesting. I think it'll be quite positive, but it's really over to Catherine. She's going to give us a short talk, and then I'll throw the floor open and you can ask questions and Catherine can then attempt to answer those. So if you all put yourselves on mute, which I think you've done, then we can ask Catherine to begin. Catherine, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you to the Global Discussion Forum. I think this is going to be a really entertaining. So over to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. And as Lee said, I have found myself by rebutting constant barrage of NFU, the National Farmers Union of the UK's incessant propaganda about how their farming standards are higher than anyone else's and Australian food is terrible, which is such a joke because I arrived in England in the 80s when the exact opposite was true. But I found myself on the UK's Trade and Agriculture Commission, which means we have to scrutinise the trade deals and actually read them. And I'm the only economist on the group, so I actually get to go through the thousands of 8-digit tariff codes and look at what's been included and what's been excluded. I have presently writing about rebutting the myths of Brexit. And the one I've been working on recently is something that incredibly our Prime Minister, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which for the Australians on the line is like the Treasurer, when the Australian trade deal was signed. But he's in a quite rural constituency. So he's actually gone on record saying that the Australian deal was rushed and that the Australian deal is one-sided and that the Australian deal is not good for UK's agricultural producers, which is, of course, a joke because that's a very, very, very small part of the UK economy. And I did think about making up some slides about that, but I don't really need to. It's not what we export. You know, the UK is a small landmass with a very large population, and it pretty much eats everything it produces and then imports more. And when they talk about exporting agricultural goods, what they mean is the offcuts. So we keep the main bits of the pork, but we send the pork knuckles to Germany. We send the beef shins to Italy. We send the bits that the British, being affluent, has stopped eating hundreds of years ago. But most European countries at the same time were very, very impoverished, something the UK population either never knew about or doesn't recognise anymore. And so they continued to eat traditional meals like tripe and tongue and things that have just gone off the menu in the UK. And so that's what they're exporting. So they like to talk about their exports to the EU, but what they mean is they're sending the bits that people in the UK don't eat. But I gave a talk about this recently, and I didn't do slides, but here are some exhibits, because within any trade deal, generally, the idea of a trade deal is to liberate the number of tariffs, to take off your tariffs. That's the basic point of a trade deal, is to stop imposing tariffs or quotas on someone else's goods. These days, they like to put lots of other clauses about small and medium-sized companies and women's rights and environmental issues. But chapter 2, the second most important chapter, and chapter 1 is usually the niceties of introducing the country, is all about the goods that we're reducing tariffs and quotas on. And the real problem with the situation is, like, this is Annex 2 of the Australian deal, which lists the things that you're not going to lift your tariffs on. It is basically one page of niceties and a tiny bit at the top here, which lists, there are about 6 goods out of 10,000 that Australia is going to take tariffs off slowly. It's about 3 types of cheese and 2 metal springs, steel springs. So this is the UK's one. It's 14 pages of restrictive quotas on everything, even things the UK doesn't make, like rice and bananas. But our idiot Prime Minister, I probably shouldn't call him that, but if he stood up and said this was a one-sided deal, you just have to wave at him the 14 pages of Annex 2, which there are over 500 goods in the trade agreement where they were either not included at all, so all restrictions have remained in place, or the restrictions will be removed slowly over 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, or even 15 years for things like Australian beef. And he thinks that's one-sided. Whereas Australia did 5, the UK did 542, and they did it over periods of time that extend to 15 years. So when people on the streets of Britain say they can't see any difference in the Australian trade deal, that's why their country is continuing to charge them for having the audacity to buy goods from another country. And so even though we've taken the tariffs on, say, Australian cheese and New Zealand cheese down slightly, it's gone from £1,000 a tonne to £900 a tonne. You know? And so it still makes it uneconomic to import goods from Australia and New Zealand, because the New Zealand trade deal is even funnier, because New Zealand didn't put any exemptions on anything. So the New Zealand trade deal basically says everything's free immediately. And the British, again, had another 14 pages restrictions on New Zealand goods. And they also included a few strange ones, like New Zealand wheat. And I'm sure the Australians on the thingy will know that New Zealand doesn't actually export wheat, but the British are so paranoid and so crazy, and their farm lobby has such power in Westminster that they threw that one in for good measure, just in case New Zealand decides to start exporting wheat. So that is my job, is to go through all of this and look at what we're doing. And it is such a pity that they have taken this attitude to trade, because the real benefits of trade for the man in the street is by being able to import goods, either better quality goods, cheaper goods, or goods that do not exist in your country. And that's kind of how trade started. So for the UK to be restricting its imports of Australian rice or Australian bananas is doubly insane, because the UK cannot possibly grow either rice or bananas. This sort of myth is perpetuated through our mainstream media, where there's a very simple saying of Brexit isn't working. And it's like, well, that's because we're not letting it work. We've signed a trade deal where we're not letting ourselves benefit from that trade deal. It's a very insane way to run a country. There have been 1 or 2 beneficiaries in our exporters, predominantly UK cars, and UK car exports to Australia doubled in the first year of the trade deal. And this is something, and also sales of planes and boats and a lot of the transport industry, which is something the UK is very good at. It is our main export by a long margin. massive margin. And yet people kind of forget about it. But that's benefited hugely from the Australian trade deal, because Australians now don't have to pay the 5% import duty that they used to pay on British cars. And that makes British cars slightly cheaper than European cars. So that's done really well. But for someone in the street going into a supermarket and wondering why there's no sign of Australian beef or New Zealand cheese or any of the things the countries are known for internationally and export all over the world, you won't see them there. The other myth that is continually propagated in the UK is this strange idea that you trade most with the closest people, and they call this the gravity model. It makes me laugh because I studied economics at Sydney University, and I did traditional economics, econometrics, and accounting. And through my whole career, no one ever mentioned the gravity model to me. It was only when I got to the UK, people started talking about this strange thing of gravity in trade. And that's because they've read a few textbooks and they've never looked at the trade figures. And I like to go through trade figures by hand because I'm that sort of nerd. It intrigues me. I play a little game with myself when I look at any kind of statistic as to how far down the list in Comtrade of 200 countries that they monitor, how far down the list I'll have to go before I've found all of the 28 EU countries. Because despite having completely free trade within the EU, that doesn't mean people in the EU buy your goods. In fact, 90% of the goods that the UK exports or imports from the EU happen with the 9 countries that are the wealthiest in the EU. Our exports are not correlated with distance. Our exports are highly correlated with the wealth of the country, the GDP per capita of the country we're exporting to. So the EU can add as many impoverished Eastern European and former Yugoslav countries that it likes, but it doesn't mean we're going to trade with them. In fact, even within the same distance, the UK buys more goods from Serbia, which is outside the EU, than we do from its neighbouring country, Croatia. And that is really, really, it just blows the whole EU idea out of the water when you find things like that. But the UK's biggest trading partner for imports is China, as it is for most of the world. And our biggest trading partner for exports is the United States. But so many people who've just read a textbook on economics and never looked at the trade figures convince themselves that it's all about the gravity model and we only trade with our close neighbours. And if you go through even history and you say, look, the UK almost invented trade, but they were bringing tea from China. They were not trading with France because, France and England have very similar climates, similar land, and grow pretty much the same stuff at the same time. So there's no need to trade with each other. And in general, they were fighting with each other. So for most of the last 1,000 years, the French and the English were in fact trying to kill each other. So they certainly weren't trading with each other. But the English were sailing all around the world and bringing back tea from China and spices from India and Indonesia and wood from the United States. So, trade here has always been an international game. But for the last 40 years, we've had people in politics who read a textbook once, never even thought to query that, even if that made sense. They never even opened the cupboard in their kitchen and looked at the stuff that's in there and thought, how much of this is coming from Europe? A hell of a lot of it isn't. But they don't know that. So that I find exhausting because I have to repeat myself over and over again. And it is probably why I was put onto this panel to review the trade deals, because I seem to be the only one on the panel who's ever gone shopping in a supermarket, ever looked at the label of because all food in the UK, this might be news to the Australians on the call, has where it comes from on it. So if you pick up a packet of beans, it will say grown in Kenya or Mexico or Chile. Now, of course, you never see this in Australia because for a long time, or at least when I was a kid there, all the food available in the supermarket was grown in Australia. Now, when I go back and visit, I do notice that the asparagus is coming from Chile and Brazil or somewhere. But in general, we're pretty self-sufficient in food in Australia, where in the UK, it's never been, and especially not in winter. You know, the few goods that we do import from the EU, we only really import in summer when it's in season.
Catherine.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Because I want to open this up to all of our guests.
I'll take a break. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very interesting what you've said so far. I've got a couple of questions to kick off with, and then I'd like to open it to the floor. When I do, can I just ask people, unmute yourself and then remute yourself once you've asked a question. Otherwise, things go a little bit crazy on these calls. Catherine, I thought what you said was very interesting, and I think will be illuminating to a lot of people on this call. First one is that you're talking absolute common sense. And it's very clear from what you've said that you're a minority voice on the Trade and Agriculture, what is it called, Commission or?
Yeah, it's Commission. Yeah.
Commission, right. So you're a minority voice there. And it's also very clear from your testimony that we are simply not taking advantage of all of the opportunities that are available. So, one of my questions is about how do we change this so that the government starts to seriously take advantage of the opportunities we now have to trade with Australia as a result of Brexit. So that's one question. In general terms, with Australia, you can almost forget the reality of the trade, and I can put up a chart in a minute to show just how trade with Australia has in fact increased, despite everything that you've said. Services you haven't particularly touched on yet. That will be something that I imagine that some people on the call will be interested in. And thirdly, I want to talk about, I'd like to hear you talk about beef and animal products. And the reason for that is because the Antipodeans on this call may not be aware, but the negative publicity about animal products, as if Australia is the cruelest nation on earth when it comes to treating their animals. I'd quite like to hear your views on that. But those are just my initial thoughts to kick people off. And I'd like to open it to the floor now. And you just give us your experience and your wisdom on. And can I ask everybody, please keep your questions to less than 90 seconds. And Catherine will try and answer within 2 minutes of each question. That way we get through quite a lot in the time available. So, Catherine, back to you.
Well, the beef one is funny because the Australians were very clever when they wrote the trade deal, and they also the trade deal doesn't override previous deals, and so since UK dropped Australia and joined the EU, we have always had been able to export merino wool or import merino wool from Australia tariff-free. But the NFU didn't understand that the UK no longer imports merino wool because the entire weaving industry has moved to China in textile industry. So they had done a huge media campaign about mulesing of sheep, and they love to promote the mulesing of sheep as a bad thing, even though it didn't affect the trade agreement at all, because the wool isn't imported into the UK, and even if it was, it's already zero rated and has been since the UK joined the EU. So there was nothing to do there. But they like to show pictures of sheep with red paint on their rear areas, which is the same antiseptic stuff they used to put on my hands and knees when I fell over in the school playground as a child, because in those days we had real asphalt on the ground rather than this sponge rubber stuff they have today. So it's just a regular antiseptic, but it was portrayed in the UK in this social media world as if it was blood, as if sheep were running around in the West with bleeding behinds from being mulesed, which is like would kill a sheep very quickly if they would attract even more flies and dingoes and God knows what, septicemia. So it was increasingly insane. They also worry about the amount of time that you can transport animals in Australia without reading the whole 115-page document on transport and discovering that, yes, if you want to transport animals for more than 12 hours, you can, but you have to fill out a massive amount of forms. You have to have various stops. You have to provide feed. You have to do all sorts of stuff that they just skipped over. So luckily, I was doing research constantly rebatting this stuff, and I found a government report on abattoirs in Australia, and that on average, cattle don't travel more than 400 kilometres to get to an abattoir, because unlike in the UK, where most abattoirs have closed down, Australia still has a lot of well-positioned abattoirs. So that their whole premise was false. They are worried about sow stalls in pigs, but they had a problem with that because they still allow pigs to come in from various EU countries that use sow stalls for up to 12 weeks, which apparently is somehow different from Australia. And they were worried about CCTV cameras in abattoirs, only to discover that they're still not required in Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. It was constantly rebatting stuff that the NFU and its sidekick, the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, who actually is the main propaganda machine. They have also published an article which got into the Telegraph about how Australia would have to demolish, cut down trees equivalent to the size of all of the UK's national parks in order to supply the UK with beef, which was such a joke, because anyone in Australia will know that most of the land where cattle are run in Australia is already mainly tree-free, but you don't knock down the trees that you have because they give the cattle shade in the summer. Also, when you compared the size of the national parks in the UK, the UK is a 1/30th of the size of Australia to start with, and the UK, as it joins the CPTPP, will have the lowest proportion of natural forests in the CPTPP, which is kind of terrifying when you consider that Singapore's in the CPTPP. But anyhow...
Catherine, can I just bring you back to a generic point?
Yeah.
Which is, the point that you made about how the UK government is not really listening about the detail on this, and that there are tariffs that will stay in place for some considerable time.
Yes.
And I think the membership of this forum might be interested in how do we exert some influence to change this?
Well, that is the £60 million question, because unfortunately, I think we're quite definitely going to get a Labor government. That could be good news for trade, because traditionally the Labor Party has represented the cities and the large towns in the UK, and almost all of the Conservative seats are in rural constituencies. So the Conservatives have been very compliant when it comes to the NFU, because though there are only 300,000 farmers left in the UK, they are a well-organised lobby group. In fact, they're better at lobbying the government for money than they are at farming, 1,000 times better, because the government is their main source of income for a lot of them. So that the Conservatives have been far too concerned with the farmers and not concerned enough with British industry, and not at all concerned with UK consumers. They're not worried in the slightest. And so hopefully, because the Labor Party is much more geared to city dwellers, they might start to realise that cheaper food is going to keep them in power.
Okay. Get all of that. So at some point in this session, it would be quite interesting to know what can the people attending the session, how can they exert some influence to change this? Now, just before I open it up to everybody, which I'd like to do now, I'm just going to put up some information on trade that is currently going on with the UK. I hope I'm going to be able to do this. So just bear with me a second, Catherine. And I think people might possibly be interested in this. So I'm going to share screen now with everybody. And I can see we've got one or two hands up. So what this is showing is it's a factsforeu.org report from only a few weeks ago. And what it shows is the overview. The UK-Australia trade deal, increase in UK goods exports to Australia. So this is from the UK's perspective. We didn't do it from the Australian perspective, but no doubt somebody could. And you can see that what you said, for example, about cars, 119% increase in the last year in UK cars exports to Australia. Ships more than doubled. Other road vehicles, well, you can see. And what it shows is the potential, I think we can say. And now I would just like to open this up to the floor. I'm going to start with my good friend Stephen Tripp from Ex-Candidates. And he's going to put a question to you. But then the floor is open to everyone. And if you can keep your questions as short as possible, and Catherine, if you can keep your answers as short as possible, we can get through a lot of people. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, hi, Catherine. I'm interested in when we look at these trade deals, who's writing them? Because a lot of these politicians, and one of the themes that we've picked up on discussing a lot of these issues with Lee and other members of this forum from here in Australia and in the UK, a lot of the problems that we face are quite similar, and a lot of them revolve around the quality of politicians and our leadership in government. We know with a lot of these politicians, they never worked in the private sector. They've never produced anything. They've never created anything themselves, but yet they're tasked with implementing these policies and writing these policies. When it comes to trade specifically, do they draw upon any expert advice that's credible, or like where is their influences coming from to write these policies?
It's I 100% agree with you, Stephen. The Australian deal, I think, was done pretty much from the public servants to public servants. and the Australians probably manage that process quite well, to say, just let's not fight about pork. We don't export pork. Let's not fight about chicken. They're just happy to agree to exclude whole sections because they are things the Australians don't export, which the British were too stupid to think about, and luckily, we have a fantastic guy in the British Trade Department who comes from New Zealand called Crawford Faulkner. And I think he's been the brains behind a lot of this and getting deals done, because it was very important that the UK got a deal done, and the Australian deal was a great one for us to start with. But you are right. We also have a lot of politicians who are very young, no experience whatsoever in industry, and they're very easily led by the industry lobby groups. And usually the group that lobbies the hardest is the one that needs government help to export. For instance, our fantastic aircraft parts industry, which is the largest supplier of aircraft parts in the world, is Britain. And that's predominantly engines, but also wings, landing gear, and seats. They don't have to lobby government because everyone wants their stuff, and they export all around the world, and they're really good at it. And you find that with, say, Japanese cars get very little support from trade. People who are really good at their game don't actually need to lobby government. And our government isn't clever enough to go, hey, why are you even here? Why don't you go back to your farm if you're such important farmers and produce goods better, more effectively than you do? So we do have this problem. And unfortunately, there's an element, and they're mainly the Romaniacs, who are trying to encourage our MPs, who are very vain and easily led, that they should get more involved with trade deals before they happen. And then you will get every MP, and as I said at the beginning, even our Prime Minister will play to their constituency and do what their constituency wants. So you will never get a trade deal because every little minute industry that's important to an MP will be out there crying for some special protection in the trade deal.
Okay, that's great, Catherine. I want to throw it open to the floor now and get some more voices and more opinions and questions for you. I know you can take on the questions because you're one of the most knowledgeable people I know in this arena. Otherwise, we wouldn't have asked you. So I've got Stuart Ballantyne with his hand up. I've got Derek with his hand up. And I've got Christian Siegel with his hand up. Hi, Christian. Nice to see you again. So I'm going to try and take these in the order in which I saw them. So can we start with Derek? You've got to unmute your... Thank you, Derek. Your question, please.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, you've described the general character of the UK-Australia situation. Does that apply broadly to the whole of the CPTPP in the same sort of general character? Or is Australia a special case? Thank you.
Well, Australia and then New Zealand closely following it were special cases because they were obviously done first and they were full bilaterals. And both countries volunteered to say that the product liberation or the tariff liberation they got in their bilaterals, they would not go for further liberation in the CPTPP. That isn't entirely true. If you'd like me, you have to read all of the tariff lines in the CPTPP. But it is for the controversial bits, the beef and the sheep meat and things like that, they've kept to the same quantities that they were given in their trade agreement. But a lot of the CPTPP is already written down, and the UK was coming at it from an outsider joining a club, if you like. So they didn't have a lot of ground to complain about, if you like. But they did put very restrictive and strangely restrictive limits on quotas of beef and pork and various goods, which are insane and show me that there is no one in the Trade Department with an economics degree. For instance, we import 600 to 700,000 tonnes of pork each year, and we've restricted the CPTPP countries to 55,000 tonnes. And one of the CPTPP countries is Canada, which is the most efficient pork producer in the world and is one of the biggest exporters. They're obviously not happy about that, and they shouldn't be. We've also restricted Vietnam to 25,000 tonnes of long grain rice. Vietnam is the third or fourth largest exporter of rice in the world, and the UK cannot possibly grow rice. Every grain of rice eaten in the UK is imported. So there are some insane things even in the CPTPP, but for most of it, the regulations are what they are. And luckily, they got rid of the EU's quotas, because the EU had done deals with a lot of CPTP countries, but the EU always kept restrictive quotas on things. So even if they dropped the tariff, they only let a very small number of tonnes come in.
Okay.
So in that, we've dropped the tonnage. So we will be able to bring in fruit and vegetables from Chile and Peru and Mexico.
That's great, Catherine. As somebody that is cooking kedgeree tomorrow, it's Fish on Friday Day, I will be using basmati rice, but you're right, it will be imported into the UK because we can't make it ourselves. I want to keep this fair. The next one I've got on my list is Stuart Valentine. What's your question, Stuart?
Hello, Catherine. I'm very interested in your comments earlier on, and I'm presently on the Queen Anne, going around UK, doing my marketing trip with ship designs. That's what I do as a job, and nice to see the number 2 export from the UK is ships, but we're trying to crack a certain nut with the UK military, which is very hard. As a small company, you've got to be part of the Ugly Sisters. With that's why your comments actually really drove home with me. The too many committees involved, but how do you crack this nut? I've managed to crack the nut with ferries, for instance, on Shetland, where we were last week, and a few other places. So, and this is a very good way, just for the guys who are on the rest of the team. A very good way to market the country is actually sit on a cruise ship. Apart from good, effective marketing, right in the middle of the city, that actually annoys the crap out of the ATO. Okay, Catherine.
So what's your question then, Stuart? Summarise.
Well, how do you crack the nut? For instance, with these little gangs, and I'm hearing Catherine say, well, you know, it's this organization, that organization, and to actually get in behind the organization, how do you actually do that? Now, number 2 is the ships, exporting ships. And we are very good ship designers, and we've just concluded an excellent contract with the US, but I can't crack that nut even just on merit. On merit. It's not about the size of the company or who we have on the board. How do we crack the nut with merit?
That's great, Stuart. Let's go to Catherine.
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, during the UK's time in the EU, they became extremely mercantilist, and they like exports, but they're never really good at imports. And the ship design probably works for them if you're not building the ship, if you can sell them the design and let them build it, because there is a lot of government initiatives to try and encourage building of ships back in the UK. I mean, when the exports of ships, I think a lot of that was what you'd probably call luxury yachts or stink boats, as we used to call them in Sydney Harbour, rather than, it sounds like you might be doing, you know, ferry design or warships and things like that. And that's a whole different department. That's not in trade. That suddenly gets into the military, and that probably involves a few really good dinners in a club somewhere in London. But I couldn't possibly comment on how they make their decisions. But I do know that one of the benefits of Brexit is we don't have to open things up to European builders, because the last time the military built a ship, it was built in Spain with Swedish steel, and though the UK got to pay for it, that was our only input. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I want to turn to my friend Christian, who is normally worth a good question. Christian, over to you. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Catherine. I would like to turn back, first of all, to the origins of trade. There are 5 people involved. There are manufacturers or growers, there are buyers, there are traders, there are transporters, and there are bankers.
Yeah.
The only thing that government has brought in was something called the Export Credits Insurance Department against political actions, including war.
Mm-hmm.
My question to you is, what does government really do in all of this?
I've given a talk about that, and I've written an article about it as well, because trade is between buyers and sellers. Consumers determine trade, not governments. All governments can really do is make it more difficult to import things and therefore protect your own industries and allow them to become inefficient, which we have seen in the EU, for instance, that olive oil in the EU magically is equal to the cost of olive oil in Morocco plus the EU tariff. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's by design. You can keep increasing your prices till you could be undercut by a close country that grows the same quality stuff. So the government bring virtually nothing. And in London, we have a massive export finance industry, which a lot of people overlook, which was developed, hundreds of years ago when people, and it's still going strong. Yeah. And all the bills of lading and things like that are still happening in London. And they are completely out of the spotlight. No one knows they're there. I doubt there'd be anyone in Parliament who even knows what they do. And without that, no trade would happen anyway. So you're right. Government does nothing. They've just set up these rules to, make some money for themselves. I mean, the whole EU was set up as a customs union, and all of the money, or 80% of the money raised in tariffs from goods coming from outside the EU actually went to Brussels. It didn't go to the countries importing it. And as the UK did the most trade outside the EU, we were paying the most customs duties to Brussels. So it was just entirely a way of collecting money. And I think it probably has been, if you went back to Greece or Rome, or the first people to establish a tariff, it was all about the ruler getting his pound of flesh out of anyone who's bringing goods in from outside the city that they can't control. I think that's all they do.
You've answered the question, Catherine. We don't need government.
No, we don't.
Thank you.
They're here.
Okay, so it looks like Lee is... are you there, Lee?
Yeah. Can I just move things along? I think I saw our good friend Rudy, another very knowledgeable person, with his hand up. Is that right, Rudy? Or where are you? I've lost you. Oh, there you go. Rudy, did you want to say anything? I thought I saw your hand up. You'll have to unmute yourself.
No, I think I was holding my head in horror. I've been dealing with plumbing problems on the phone all day, so I'm afraid I haven't been listening at full strength. But
well, then I'll cut you off then, Rudy, if you've got nothing intelligent.
Okay.
We've got Stephen Tripp is asking a question, and Derek is asking a question. And by the way,
can I also add another topic we could talk about, having listen to the John Redwood interview with this group, because I'm presently writing about a dreaded thing that will make trade even more difficult, and it's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which the EU has already bought in, and the UK is planning on bringing in December next year.
Yes, that's a very good point, Catherine. And one of the problems that those of us who try to get messages out to millions of voters, can you imagine how difficult it is to talk about carbon adjustment? It just, people, switch off. We have to find ways of getting these kinds of things out there. And one of the great things about this forum is we do have some people who attend that, like me, want to get the message out. And, I'm looking at Justin down below, for example. He's very good at organising stuff. Alistair, who's been remarkably quiet, actually, to date for an opinionated Scotsman. But there you go. So I know Derek wanted to speak, and Stephen wanted. So we start with Stephen. He came first. Stephen?
Well, I might be setting the cat amongst the pigeons now by asking you this question, but I might just quickly try and bring this. No, I can't share screen, but a lot of the minor parties here in Australia, and I want to shift the focus to Australia just briefly, they talk a lot about the Lima Declaration, which goes back to 1975, in which Gough Whitlam signed up Australia to this declaration that supposedly reduced our manufacturing and caused us to take imports of production from third world countries. Is the Lima Declaration a big concern? Did it have a big impact on Australia? Is it something that we should review?
Well, we've all actually benefited hugely. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of the Lima Declaration, but I know that all around the world for years we've been getting more and more of our manufacturing has moved to third world countries, which are now developing countries. Some of them are now incredibly wealthy countries, such as China. And that has benefited us because we get cheaper goods. And there's a hell of a lot of things that have virtually remained the same price for years because of that, the cost of production of things has gone down as we've moved it to cheaper and cheaper places. Obviously, we are getting to the sort of top of that maximization curve because A, we're running out of cheaper places to move things to. B, we've discovered that allowing China to make everything doesn't always work out well and now we're actually seeing that they don't need us at all. There's a lot of people in the UK who are upset about, say, China making steel. But if you look at China's steel production, they produce about 1 billion tons of steel each year, and they use 900 million of those tons in China. Their exports are about 10% of their production. And while the US and the UK complain about them undercutting their steel production, you now see that China is in fact sending its steel to Indonesia because Indonesia is going through, and the Philippines, they're going through what China went through because China moved 700 million people, more than the population of Europe and the US, from hovels into skyrise apartment buildings. And the same thing is happening all over Asia, and it's happening with Chinese steel and Chinese cement, and in countries that are not going to play the EU-US regulation game of trying to add border adjustment taxes onto their production. They're just going to say, oh, we'll sell it to someone else. So we might have really shot ourselves in the foot with this one. And we've got to sit back and think about what we can do well.
Okay.
So well, Stephen, we could talk more about this at another time because I can talk about the steel industry in Australia, who, even in the 80s, when I was going through university, it was cheaper to send the coal and the iron ore to Japan, make it into steel there and import it back, than it was to send it to BHP Steelworks in Newcastle and Wollongong to make it into steel in Australia, because we were using very old technology and we hadn't upgraded our technology in the way that the people in Japan had. Okay. Now, obviously, Japan and South Korea, they lost out to South Korea. South Korea's lost out to China. Eventually China the industry will maybe move to Indonesia or somewhere, but it is this game where you're running out of options. And I think that we've probably come full circle and it's time to revisit what we can do. I don't want to bring back industries that we're really bad at, but with more AI and more robotics, we could do a lot more locally, both in Australia and in the UK and in the US. But this all requires cheap power. And the UK has done the most horrendous things to its energy supplies. And I fear that Australia, who was for a while incredibly sensible, may be going the same route. Luckily, the US talks a big game about the green issues, but they still have the cheapest commercial electricity in the world. And that will keep them in the robotics game. But the rest of us are going to be in trouble if we try and mechanize and discover we don't have the power to do that.
Well, sorry, can I just intervene? Because I'm trying to get as many voices into this debate as I possibly can, and I'm trying to take them in order. At the moment, I've got Justin, and then Kevin.
Hello, yes, hello, I can ask my quick question.
Yes, hang on. I've just got to mute Christian because he's talking to somebody in the background. Lovely man, but so Justin, you're an interesting figure in the UK for those around the world who don't know you.
So I help out with the Bruges Group, and we're an anti EU pro-British sovereignty group, and we've been sort of banging the drum as regards the things like the Windsor Framework, and I fear our work is about to double under a Labour government. But I suppose the point out is my role is trying to get the word out, but it's very hard in the current social media landscape. But hopefully when minds are focused under a Labour government, we'll have a bit more impetus and complement the great work that you do at Facts for EU. So just to ask my question of Catherine, is a two-part question. Firstly, have we actually acceded to the CPTPP? Because I hear lots of things about we've got another country needed before it happens, and can Labour undo it? And then secondly, I've always held the view that we don't really need a trade deal to trade. I grew up in the USA. You go to any US store these days full of English goods. Are we better off having state-by-state deals with well-matched economies, Florida, UK, kind of the same size, much easier than doing it with the massive economy of the USA, which requires Congress? So are we better doing state-by-state deals more about trade facilitation rather than trying to get a US trade deal which requires congressional approval with all the pork barrel politics that entails? So those are my two questions.
Well, I'll just quickly do the CPTPP. It is meant to be, hopefully will come into force in October this year. They were talking about June this year, but obviously the elections probably pushed that back. And I believe we're still waiting for 3 more countries to ratify it. In terms of the US...
Sorry, the short answer, Catherine, is no.
October? Oh, yeah, the short answer is no, it's not in force yet. B, they
can the Labour government block it?
I don't think that they could at this stage, and I don't imagine that people would... they'd have to have a really good reason for doing that. And because of the massive restrictions on agricultural imports, as I said earlier, even rice, I think they'll have a hard time justifying why they would not want to do that deal, because it could be hugely beneficial and is one of those things where already UK farmers aren't complaining about it because they have the possibility to export to places like Singapore and Japan that import a lot of their food. and would be rich enough to pay for British beef and British lamb or whatever, Stilton cheese, whatever they sell them. So,
can I just add a point of information here? Facts for EU published a couple of weeks ago. The deal, the CPTPP deal, has been ratified now by the British Parliament. And
yes.
That's just an important point to make, Catherine, that it's been ratified by the British. It's essentially agreed by everybody else, but ratification processes in some of these countries takes months, and there's a few countries still to ratify, but essentially the deal's in place.
Right, yeah. As for the US is an interesting country because a lot of its rules, especially its service rules, are actually state by state. So it's important that we do these MOUs with the states because our biggest exports now are service exports. They were 55% of our exports in 2023. And things like an insurance company, which is one of our bigger exports, and our biggest customer is the US, but they have to get approval from every state to operate there. You'll also find the states that they have done these deals with. They've done Washington, which is obviously where the US aerospace industry is. So we're selling our biggest parts export, the aircraft parts and engines, is all going to Washington. We've done a deal with some of the states that have big fracking things going on because of BP and Shell, some of our biggest companies. And we've done things with North Carolina, which is where the Raleigh Triangle is, and they're also doing a lot of stuff with financial services. So they've been quite selective of which states, and they're working on Texas and Chicago and New York, which will probably be all they'll do by state. And then they've kind of got it covered as to what's important to the UK. There are potentials if we do a deal. We could sell more to the US and we could buy more for them. Everyone forgets that we still have 10% tariffs on US cars here. We still have tariffs on US white goods, US, washing machines and refrigerators are half the price that we pay for the same in the UK. And the ones we're buying in the UK are mainly made in Germany or in the EU. So there's no reason why we couldn't move to US suppliers. But, get a Whirlpool or whatever they are, General Electric, GE. But we haven't. And people have forgotten that there's a lot of goods that the US makes that we're just so, hypnotized that we have to buy goods made in Germany. And the Germans have even wiped out all the Italians. And so we're a captured market in a lot of these goods. And the US could supply them, if not entirely, just give us a choice and allow people who don't want to pay £1,000 for the Miele can pay £500 and get the Whirlpool. It's just greater consumer choice. So I would be quite in favour of a US trade deal. We also add 12% on US clothes. So Levi's jeans and Ralph Lauren clothes, they're all much more expensive in the UK than they are in the US. So there's a lot of things we could do. So I wouldn't balk at a trade deal. I'm not sure that the Labour government will be interested in doing that, of course, but maybe they will.
Catherine, thanks for that. So just to summarise, by the way, we have, to my knowledge, done 5 statewide US deals so far. Highly significant deals if you compare them with the size of the economies of most of the EU countries. The US state deals are bigger than most of them. I think Catherine would agree. So just moving things along, Kevin had his hand up. He wants to ask a question. Kevin is a good friend who seems to know something about everything. And so, Catherine, prepare yourself.
Okay.
Hi, Catherine. I've got so much to say and too little time to say it in, and too many questions to ask as well. A long time ago, I was responsible for what was called the War Book. I served for 32 years in the Australian Army Regular and Active Reserve. And in the War Book was listed all of those things which are critical in industry for Australia to participate in a limited war of the type of World War II. When I say that, that's as opposed to counter-revolutionary, which was really Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. So we last year exported $470 billion of goods and services, the goods primarily being iron ore, coal and raw materials of that nature, and the services being education. If I were to be successful in my desire to fully automate Australian industry, and the beautiful thing about that is that all of the factory workers have been long ago retrenched. So if I was to automate Australian industry, I wouldn't have to sack a whole lot of people. But if I was to do that, and we're still exporting $470 billion worth of goods and services, and we've got everything here in Australia. We can make everything here in Australia. What do we do? How does trade work? Yeah, I'm just arriving at that point now, Lee. Be patient now. Be patient. How does trade work? Because for a country like Australia, I personally could automate all of the manufacturing in Australia such that not a human hand touched it. I could also reduce the cost of energy by at least 5 times here in Australia, and reduce the cost of liquid fuels by at least half. So in other words, we have no need to trade with anybody, but everybody wants $470 billion worth of goods and services from us. How does it work?
Well, you can do that. I mean, both China and Germany are very mercantilist, and they have been generally selling a lot more than they buy. And weirdly, or not weirdly, you won't be surprised to know Australia is one of the few, if maybe the only country in the world that has a trade surplus with China. And that is entirely because without your coal and iron ore, China stops tomorrow. And that's useful to know if they start bombing you. You know, remember that. But it is, you will find that there are things that you didn't think about that you are buying. You know, you may not recognise that you're buying, though I know the Australian government has tried to stop you doing this, but you're buying services from the existence of Amazon, not just the goods you get from Amazon, but the actual service you get from Amazon and Facebook and Google and, you know, X and all of these different things. You're actually buying a lot of services in that way. You do also import a lot of legal services and accounting services from British companies that you might not recognise, because sitting in Sydney and Melbourne, there are very large legal firms and accounting firms and banks that are all branches of international accounting firms and banks. So it doesn't look like an import as it does if a good is coming out of a container. But last time I went to Port Botany, you are importing, like every car in Australia is imported at the moment, every truck. And it's very heavily geared to road transport. And all of that stuff is imported. So all of the vehicles on the roads are imported, and possibly the boats and the planes and all of the transport, because that is a key in Australia. Is we're very reliant on transport because of the distances that things are covering, and even getting the goods out of Port Hedland or wherever the coal's coming from. That you've got a lot of transport getting things away. So you're probably importing more things that you can't replace as easily as you may think. But at the same time, you're right. I think Australia is a very lucky country, and it could, if it had to, which we saw during the COVID thing, where during COVID, Australia could actually seal its borders and survive. And the UK did the most weird thing where it locked all its population in its house, but it didn't seal its borders because it can't. It physically cannot survive without imports of food coming in from mainly these days continental Europe and Ireland, but also from other countries, so that they could never seal the borders in the way that the Australians could. So they even kept the airports open for tourists. It was really quite silly because, unlike in Australia, I flew into Australia during COVID and I was met with people in hazmat suits and put in a bus and sent to a sealed room in a hotel for 2 weeks before I was allowed out. When I came back to the UK, I was able to take the tube from London Heathrow. No one with hazmat suits took the tube back to my house. And I was meant to stay in my house for 10 days, or 5 days, I think it was. And someone would ring me on my mobile phone every day to check that I was in my house. So great. And they wonder why it didn't really stop COVID. But it's you're right. Australia could survive without imports, but they would have to get industry back that they've lost. And I don't know that people even want that, because everyone all of my mates in the country who used to always drive utes and fight about whether the Holden ute was better than the Ford ute, they've now all got those US trucks with a back seat in them. I don't know what the official name is, but they're all driving those. And I think a lot of the population has moved on, if you like, and they've moved into this sort of international imports, if you like, and they're wearing,
The problem we face is that as a country, we're extremely vulnerable if we're not self-sufficient in manufacturing. We're actually cut off from the rest of the world, and we could be very easily cut off by communist China. And we would have no way of being able to basically conduct a limited war. We would be totally dependent on people being able to transport war material to this country, which is a far cry from where we were at the end of World War II, where we were making just about everything we needed: guns, ammunition, explosives, and vehicles. And believe me, it is entirely possible with automation for all of that to come back to Australia now. In fact, we are very well positioned to do exactly that.
Well, and you're not the only one. And this is the main reason behind Biden's, what they call the Inflation Reduction Act, is really about onshoring industries. Because even the US military, and I was speaking at a convention last year about this, even they are relying on imported materials for all of their weaponry. And they have very modern weaponry, but it all relies on computer chips, which are coming out of Taiwan. And even China relies on computer chips from Taiwan. Its biggest import supplier by value is Taiwan. And the 90% of that is computer chips. Obviously, Australia is its biggest supplier by volume, but it's so the whole world has woken up to exactly what you're talking about, Kevin, and everyone is suddenly going, wait a minute.
Coming back to that question, though, how do you handle a large trade surplus?
Kevin, hang on. We've got to make sure we involve everybody, if you don't mind, in all of this.
Germany has had a large trade surplus, and China has as well. Technically, it would increase your currency, but both of those countries, that hasn't happened because Germany is part of the euro, and for every time it increases its exports in, Italy and Greece and Spain take another dive down. So that keeps the euro at about the same level. And the same things happen with China because they control their currency completely. But both countries have been happily having a massive surplus for years and got away with it. So I think that Australia could do that as well if they wanted to.
Okay, Catherine, I'd like to chip in, if I may, with a couple of questions. I'd like to talk about what's going on between Australia and the EU, because those negotiations seem to have stalled completely, and you may have some information you can give us on that. And secondly, I know this isn't your particular area, but you mentioned Taiwan, and some of us are deeply concerned about that, and the South China Sea. Do you have any comments on that? So that's my two-part question. But the first one, I know you can answer. The second one, you may want to sidestep.
Well, weirdly, I would be in the other camp, because the EU's negotiations with Australia, as far as I'm aware, have broken down completely. I don't think they're negotiating anything anymore. And this is the second time they've broken down completely. They were doing something in 2007, I think, and that didn't work. The real problem with the EU is the stranglehold its farmers have on the whole EU organisation, in the same way that they spent 20 years negotiating with the Mercosur countries in South America. And then at the last minute, the French pulled the plug on that entire agreement with the Irish's help, because they didn't want Brazilian beef coming in and spoiling their captured market. And the same thing will happen to Australia, even though very few countries in Europe still have iron ore. The Swedes and the Austrians are about the only ones producing any quantity of iron ore. And so the EU really needs to get much closer to Australia and get Mount Isa, and then, sorry, not Mount Isa, Western Australia, heading to Europe instead of going to China and India. But they haven't really thought that through, and they're just being led by the farmers as usual.
And we could also move on. Stephen has his hand up, but we could also move on at some point to Australia's strength in precious metals like lithium, which is not really understood in the UK very much, but we could talk about that. But first of all,
lithium is something even the UK has. But the problem with all of the rare earths and the metals is not finding them; it's the refining of them.
Yeah,
refining is a very dirty process, and many people don't want that back. They've been happy to let China do it, because there's nowhere in the UK where any community is saying, "Oh yes, we'll have that."
Yeah, I mean, let's come back to that if we've got time. Let's come back to
as with Taiwan, the thing that keeps Taiwan where it is its expertise in making computer chips. And Correct. Two things are going to be a problem for Taiwan. A, the next generation of computer chips is coming along fast, so that they may lose that expertise. And B, the Chinese are also trying to make the computer chips that they were getting from Taiwan, but they require very fine, highly refined silicon, which is actually coming out of the EU, out of Holland. And so they're going to have trouble just getting those raw materials if they start playing up. But right now, they're working more and more with Russia. They're taking Russian oil and supplying Russia with tanks and equipment to invade the Ukraine. So China might just
get through. So okay. I want to get on to Stephen again in a moment. But when it comes to lithium, you're right. In West Country, particularly Cornwall, has massive lithium deposits, which we're not taking advantage of. It's a little bit like all the North Sea oil that we're not taking advantage of. But I don't want to get into that right now. Let's come back to that if we've got time. I'd always like to involve as many people as possible. And Stephen has his hand up, so let's take Stephen's question next.
You mentioned before the Western world being heavily reliant on China, and we saw that during COVID with mask production. All the masks were coming out of China, and Australia wasn't capable of producing its own masks. Is there an opportunity for trade to strengthen our national security? And this might be a broad question, but if all the Five Eyes countries came to you, that's Canada, the US, New Zealand, United States of America and Australia, if they all came to you and said, how can we use trade to strengthen the Five Eyes and essentially the Western world, and also taking into account how can we also strengthen our relationships with the rest of the world and not be so heavily reliant on a potential adversary like China? What would you do to do that? What are some of the things that you would like to see happen amongst those Five Eyes countries?
Well, I think that Joe Biden is already doing that. I mean, he probably didn't think of it himself. I'm sure the US military complex is guiding his hand, and they are trying to bring things back. And that's where they're discovering that the Rust Belt has reinvigorated itself, as has in the UK. So a lot of ports and harbours and towns that did a lot of industry have now turned those ports into hotels and malls and universities, and they've completely changed what they do. And so it's one thing to say we should bring industry back to the country, but then you have to find a place where it will go and where you'll have the skilled workforce that will be able to work in it. So it's kind of tricky, and it is something we have to think about. The other option is to find a new China. I mean, the West created China. If we hadn't encouraged our companies to buy things and send their production to China, China would still be what it was when I was a child, where people were starving in China, and instead we encouraged them to come into the Western world. Now, the most obvious place to move things to is to move to India and say, well, companies, stop making your goods, iPhones in China, and make them in India, which is an easy move, and has a very highly skilled, highly educated workforce, a bigger workforce than China, actually. So it has everything that you would need to do that, and it has a democratic government, which is interesting.
But essentially, aren't we making, sorry to cut in, but essentially aren't we making the same mistake as we did with China by trying to centralize everything in one country?
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next thing is, don't use just one country. You have to have a few. You should look to Brazil as well. Brazil has also got a lot of the raw materials you need. It's got a very well-educated, large workforce, big country. There's several places around the world you could use a lot more. And even Vietnam is cutting China's lunch in a lot of production. The Philippines, Indonesia, there's a lot of places that we should start. I've often said that with the UK as well. We have to diversify our trade, but because having several sources of supply gives you security. And not only in COVID did we discover they make all of the protective equipment and the masks, but China was making 80% of the ingredients for pharmaceuticals. So even if the pharmaceuticals were still being made in Europe somewhere or the US, the core ingredients used to make that were coming out of China. So even things like paracetamol were in short supply because no one had the base ingredients. So there's some things that we have stupidly let go of because they're not, they don't require a high amount of labour. And, we could make them ourselves. We just, because they're now made in bulk and there's no money in it, if you like, we've stopped making it.
Okay, Catherine, we've got a question online for you, and it relates back to when you were talking about the US state trade deals. I know what my answer to this question is, but nobody's interested in that. They're interested in yours. So the question is that these US state trade deals are not trade deals. They are memoranda of
understanding. Yes, that's true.
And whilst that is technically correct, would you like to comment on that?
No, that is entirely correct. But it doesn't mean that isn't creating trade opportunities. So having done that deal, you find that because a lot of things, especially in services, they're not actually restricted on a national level in the US. They are restricted by a state level, and you need to get approval by the state governor. So say, here's something I actually know a bit about. a US gambling company that gambles online wanted to establish branches in the US, and they had to get approval from each state that they were going to operate in. Now, they were able to do that. They don't need a trade agreement to do that, but they do need approval to do that. So the MOUs have also enabled a company out of Cambridge called Marshall, which makes parts for planes. They've been able to set up a factory in North Carolina where they're doing the same thing. And they did that as part of the MOU. So there's a lot of company to state trade, actual trade happening without a trade agreement. And the trade agreement is a much bigger thing and covers obviously more industries. And as I said earlier, the chapter 2 of any trade agreement is about the goods you're dropping the tariffs on. But there's another 10 chapters after that on a whole lot of niceties about mutual acceptance of university things or whatever, which is kind of crazy, because if someone turned up to your company with a degree from MIT, Lee, I'm sure you wouldn't say, oh, I can't accept that because it's not a UK university. You just go, okay, you're really smart, we can hire you. But these sort of things are all included in trade agreements, which means that someone from some university in the back of Alabama will also be able to turn up and say, yes, I'm a doctor, here's my certificate, and you'll have to accept them as well. So it's a lot more complicated, but the MOUs are useful and they are working, and they have worked already.
That's a very helpful clarification. Thanks for that, Catherine. We've got 30 minutes left, everyone. So number one, anyone that hasn't asked a question yet or spoken, please feel free. Just stick your hand up for about 5 seconds so that I can spot you. And the more views that we have, the merrier. The next area that I thought might be interesting for Catherine to comment on is, aside from Alistair, who's going to go on the attack fairly shortly, I'm pretty sure, from Vietnam. But the next area I thought might be interesting to talk about is when it comes to what we've been used to in the UK, which are EU trade deals that aren't really trade deals at all, because they've never included services. And now they include almost everything under the sun, including green policies, LGBTQ plus policies, you name it. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that the members attending today might be interested in Catherine's direct views about all of that. But after that, floor is open to you all. You can ask Catherine anything you want. She's a tough old bird, as we used to say in my day. I don't think I'm allowed to say that these days, but anyway. Yeah.
Well, we're all of an age where you probably can. Justin might be a bit young, but the rest of us won't be shocked by that.
Yeah. Justin will probably throw his hands up in horror, but
I'm just appalled by you all.
Yeah, I know. I'm appalled by the trade agreements that I see. I try and stick in my part of the commission. I really stick to the goods. The goods for me are the most important thing. I get involved with the environmental chapters quite heavily, mainly because that is being used as a way of blocking the goods. In fact, my main interest in all of the additional chapters, which they do put into these trade agreements, I think to give people jobs and make them worry about stuff they don't need to, is how will that affect the goods? Because that also came up in the CPTPP, which luckily had been written for us, and we had to join it. Because in the CPTPP, you have countries with very different standards of living and wage levels, and to try and inflict the UK's working time directive, say, on a country like Vietnam or Peru, where people are just lucky to have jobs at all without getting 3 weeks of paid holiday leave or whatever. You know, it's like, it would be crazy. It's completely different if you're doing a trade deal between two equivalent countries. So to do a trade deal between Australia and the UK, we have very similar standards of living. But even then, they wanted to impose some crazy regulations in agriculture onto Australia. For instance, and this is the dumbest one, one of the reasons the UK thinks Australia has low standards of animal welfare is because we do not have a rule saying that animals must have 10 hours of light a day. The UK has this rule because so many of their animals are kept in sheds during the winter, and many of their animals are kept in sheds their entire lives. So they have rules about light. And the DEFRA department who wrote this directive to the Trade Commission couldn't understand why Australia doesn't have a regulation like that. And luckily, there's another New Zealand fellow on the Trade Commission, and the two of us would fall about laughing because they didn't know that all Australian cattle live outside. Even if they're living in a feedlot, they're outside. And, you know, there are crazy rules that the British have adopted from the EU and they think should apply everywhere, because so many of the people writing these rules have never left the country. They all claim they wanted to be in the EU so they could live anywhere, but most of them have never lived anywhere outside of Westminster. And it shocks me that they try and do this. So we were very lucky with the CPTPP that they didn't try and force their rules onto countries, Malaysia, Vietnam, whatever, who have very different lifestyles, different climates, different employment rights, and so we got around all of that. But you're right, all of these extra chapters are there, and they're often backdoor ways of restricting trade. So the environmental one for Australia was very much because they'd been fed this lie by the WWF that Australia would have to knock down trees to produce cattle, and luckily we could prove with Australia's statistics that they have planted more trees than there are trees in England. I mean, we were lucky that the British on the other side were so stupid that they hadn't actually looked up any facts. They'd got their information from the Daily Mail or somewhere. But it was interesting how they tried to use these additional chapters in the trade deal to really try and block the trade deal. But, yeah. Was there another question, or was that it? Or have you gone, Lee? Have you dropped out?
Lee looks like he's busy, but I might jump in because I don't see anyone else. But I want to switch to agriculture because you are on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, and we just had a.
Yes. But Stephen, agriculture, I think, is a good question for the Australian audience.
Yeah,
we just had a big forum here in Sydney on the weekend, and a lot of the farmers were recounting stories of the environmental destruction that's taking place due to the rollout, what we call here the reckless rollout of wind and solar projects. It's having tremendous impacts on agricultural land as well, because people don't consider the fact that a lot of these solar and wind projects have to be built in areas that are not close to the transmission grid. So not only are you taking up large amounts of land for wind and solar, and here in Australia we have these renewable energy zones. One in particular, the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone, takes up 20,000 square kilometres of land, and that's currently going to include over 1,000 wind turbines and 9 million solar panels in that area. Just a tremendous amount of land that needs to be taken up for these projects. But a lot of that is on agricultural land, and it doesn't take in consideration the transmission lines that now have to be directed out through agricultural land and other areas to get out there. So there's tremendous environmental destruction taking place. Also, these wind and solar, the components are coming from China. 80% of the components come from China. Are you concerned with the rollout of what we might say is unaffordable, unreliable, intermittent energy, otherwise known as renewables?
100%. And if you think it's bad in Australia, on the plus side, at least you have some. They're doing the same in the UK. The same people who are complaining about imported food from Australia and New Zealand and have insisted on this incredibly long timeline before the food can actually come in tariff-free are also promoting farmers in the UK. They're paying them to take their land out of food production, and besides growing wildflowers or birdseed, they're also able to put up solar panels in a country that is 50 degrees north, at the very lowest point. We're 50 degrees north of the equator. We have very dark winters and we have a huge amount of cloud cover. So even on a day like today, where the sun is shining, which has been very rare and this year so far, you've still got a sky full of clouds. So our solar panels pick up very little sun, and yet we are subsidising them to do this to what would otherwise be perfectly fertile land with a very reliable rainfall, very, very reliable rainfall, something that Australian farmland doesn't have, and yet they're carpeting it with solar panels here too. It is insane, and I think that either the politicians in both countries are getting massive handouts from the Chinese government, or they are just insane, stupid people. I have noticed that a lot of the people in the UK that I deal with have never studied even the basic level of science and maths. But when I went through school, I did maths till the end of and science till the end of my school year, and physics and chemistry, sort of the real science. But they don't even have that in the UK. You find because they have very narrow educations, they get down to 3 subjects in their final years. And that, if you're going to be in humanities, that's probably going to be English and history, maybe classics, Latin. They don't know any science. They are so easily conned by people who are making a fortune out of the government, because our grid is so bad that you can put up wind farms and solar farms and you can't actually connect them to the grid because the grid can't take the extra capacity. And they are also in the process of clearing land to put up new grid structures. And meanwhile, we pay our wind turbines. We do have a lot of wind, but half the time the wind turbines in Scotland are being paid to turn off. And our hapless politicians have only just discovered that a lot of those turbines are actually charging the government for more hours than they were actually turned off for. So, and people have only just started to check that and realised how much they're being ripped off. And you're right, it is the Chinese government has gone after this they've put a lot of subsidies into developing solar panels. They make, I think it's 3/4 of all of the panels internationally are made in China, and they are making them at a lower cost than any other country. And
Catherine, you're completely right on this. We need to try to keep to the main topic today, because we are hitting the whole climate change agenda on a regular basis. Okay. There's a couple of people we haven't heard from. I don't know if they want to speak or not, but one of them, he's been uncharacteristically quiet. A difficult bugger, I think we would say, but I love him to death, and that's Alistair, who is, I think, currently in Vietnam, and it'd be interesting if he's got any thoughts. And the other one is Tony, I call him Tony Pantangelo from the Godfather movies, but it's Tony Pentogin.
Yeah.
And if you want to ask. Now's your time. You've only got about 15 minutes. So Alistair's got his hand up. Go for it.
All right. I'll start off. But first, I want to make some comments on things you made earlier. A friend of mine used to run a chicken farm. He used to get these 6-day-old chicks in. He'd keep them for about 6 weeks, fatten them up, kill them. I used to ask him if he wore a Nazi uniform, but he apparently not. But he actually gave it up when he was finally told he had to introduce coloured table tennis balls for the chickens to play with. Now, I don't actually want to talk to the chicken before I kill it and eat it, but that's just a personal view on my part. A couple of other things there. When I was in England, actually, I used to like to go to the market there and do a world tour and see where everything came from. And I was quite surprised how little food actually came out of Australia. Now, the other thing that was mentioned by Kevin about defence, what'll kill Australia and why we'll be out of the business of survival is we got 21 days of fuel, and we import it all because we've closed down all the, we have no strategic industry or any concept. A fellow I know here, actually, his job is to actually move industries from China to Vietnam, and he's very successful in making quite a lot of money out of that. I'll make the other comment about Lake George. Sorry, it's a thing there. There's a wind farm at Lake George, which is in a wind shadow. So the turbines don't actually turn, but they do, because they're actually connected to diesel generators, because they get more money from the electricity then produce and send to Canberra. So that's the stupidity of what's going on. Now, my question was about versus the autarky of Australia, which was mentioned by Kevin earlier. In 1964, I've got his name now, a senator from Tasmania wrote a book called Lifeboat Australia. I don't know if you came across it before your time, 64. I know you weren't born then. It was actually about, we're an autarky. We have almost everything we need. We should sell what we need overseas to buy in those things we can't make here. And that was his thesis. And it's still applicable today, as Kevin has pointed out. So my question for you here is, what is the strategic plan, trading plan or whatever plan, to actually make countries more self-sufficient, be it the UK or Australia or a combination of us and our friends?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure the UK, we have one step forward in self-sufficiency and two steps back generally. As Lee's mentioned earlier, and I've written many times, the UK has huge reserves of oil and gas in the North Sea, which they stopped issuing new licenses for under the last Labor government. It was made worse by Boris Johnson and Theresa May, actually. Theresa May was the worst person for the environment in terms of keeping the country's lights on. And we're going to get the same environment minister back in a couple of weeks after the next election, which is terrifying because he's a real idiot and he's the son of a communist and, a card-carrying communist in the UK. So, I'm not sure what he's playing at, because not only are we closing down oil and gas in the UK and importing it from Norway most of the time, but also LNG from the US and Qatar, which is 4 times worse for the environment than getting our own gas out of the North Sea. But because we've dropped the production of oil and gas, our refinery, our biggest refinery up in Scotland, is going to close next year. So we will soon be in the same boat as Australia, where we are importing more and more of our oil because we can't refine it here, even if we're still able to pull it out of the North Sea. The refinery that's closing is responsible for 13% of the fuel, I think it is, in the UK. But it's, and then, of course, we had a very big industry of chemicals and pharmaceuticals and plastics were run out of the UK because they are all made with the short-chain hydrocarbons which come out of the refining process when the petrol is taken out. And, of course, once you close the refineries, you lose those as well. So the inputs of the plastic companies and the chemical companies are also disappearing. So it won't be long before the plastics and the chemicals and the pharmaceutical companies also move their production out of the UK. And, in fact, INEOS, one of our biggest companies, so it's a private company, has production I think it's 28 countries around the world, or maybe it's 128 countries. And they're already saying that they're going to move out of the UK. There's no point really in staying there. So the UK has this insane idea where they recognise the problems with being too dependent on China. But unlike the US, they're not actively encouraging businesses to onshore, and they are still trotting down this crazy road of actively closing down the most important businesses in the country. Okay. Under this strange idea that in this very small, narrow country, if there's a drop in the wind, all you need is more windmills to make up for the lost electricity.
Catherine,
and it's ridiculous. You can look at any news weather report and see that if the wind is blowing on the West Isles, it's also blowing on the east, on the North Sea. You know, it's not, you cannot survive with more windmills to make up for a loss of electricity. You need to have nuclear power, which Australia should have too. I'm a big, big fan of nuclear power, and I cannot believe that Australia has the uranium and has never made it into nuclear power. Okay.
Catherine, as chairman, I have to intervene. We're drifting off into another topic here. Rudy had his hand up for a question. What's your question, Rudy? Let's hope it's about trade, economic relations. And knowing you, I suspect not. You'll be drifting off into climate change, but that's not.
No, it's actually about it. It is exactly the trade question, which is that, I mean, when I sort of learned sort of basic economics, it sort of started with, well, you know, you have a trade surplus in or deficit in manufactured goods, and then you worry about how to pay for it. And well, maybe you can pay for it with services, or maybe you can sell some of your investments or whatever. Why is it that nobody in the West cares about trade balances anymore? Why is it that it just doesn't matter to anyone that the UK can spend money willy-nilly? Oh, you know, however many hundreds of billions we need every year to borrow from somewhere else. Why does nobody care, and how long can it go on for? That's my question to you as an insider.
I would say it's because the education in economics in this country is appalling. And most of the people I know who claim to have studied economics did a degree called PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. And it's really studied in that order. It's really about politics. Most of them don't understand trade. And what intrigues me, and this has happened with the BBC promoting it, is they use a thing called total trade, where they add your imports and your exports. And when you say, no, what's important is your trade balance, you have to take one away from the other, they don't get that at all. And they then have invented this new thing called trade intensity, which was around when I was studying economics. But we actually thought from an Australian point of view that trade intensity being too high was a bad thing, because it meant you were too reliant on trade. Trade intensity is total imports plus exports of services and goods divided by your GDP. But the insane brigade who give information to the government and the BBC have convinced people that having a higher trade intensity is a better thing. And during the 22 sort of oil and gas crisis, Italy and France and Germany, who are entirely dependent on imported oil and gas, neither of them have oil and gas, their trade intensity went through the roof because they were importing so much oil and gas to make up from Russia, and the price was so high. And the BBC thought that was a good thing. And their economists are going, oh, our trade intensity hasn't increased. And you're going, well, that's because we both export oil and gas still a little bit, and we import it. So it sort of balances itself out. So it's not adding into this. And it was driving me crazy that they actually like to add trade together and measure it on total trade. And the fact that the UK's imports are so much larger than our exports is not something they're concerned with.
I can tell you that both CIB UK and Facts4EU constantly try to make this point about conflating imports and exports as trade. They're two different things, exports and imports. It's not that imports aren't important, they are, but just splashing the two together is unhelpful. Now, I'd like to, as we approach our last 5 minutes, I'd like to offer the opportunity to anyone who wants to talk, but particularly my great colleague and Deputy Chairman at CIB UK, Ben Phillips, and somebody I've learned.
Don't forget Tony.
Tony, yeah.
Hey, shut up! I'm just about to say, and somebody that I've learned to love over the last year, Tony. And I'd like to start with Tony. You must have something to say, Tony, about this.
Well, first of all, I love you too, Lee. And my surname, just for the record, is pronounced Pentagenous. Some of my friends call me Pentagenous. Some of my friends call me Pentagenius, and you can call me that as well if you like.
I'll stick with that one.
Very informative, Catherine. Look, this is a topic that I'm not very familiar about, but the things that I'm hearing is shocking me as much as the whole climate change thing has shocked me. This is sounding like yet another typical things that governments just can't get right. I guess I don't really have a specific question, but more, well, maybe I do. Well, these strange deals that these countries do, is it because they do other deals, behind other deals to get things, and therefore they're sacrificing, certain things in order to get under other deals because it's in some politician's advantage or some lobby group? Is that why? Like, it's all just convoluted because of all these underhanded deals that perhaps occur? Would that be fair to say that, or why is it they do these weird deals?
It's a great question. I suspect that they say the Australia deal, they wanted to get a deal on the board. They needed to placate the UK farmers lobby, so they gave, as I said, 542 restrictions on Australian agricultural goods to placate the farmers lobby. And they also obviously knew they would benefit because Australia doesn't sell cars anymore, and cars are one of the UK's biggest exports. So, there were things they knew they would benefit from it. And they just did give in to this lobby group, and it's ridiculous. And then the lobby group tried to sell it as if they had been really hardly done by this deal and had really lost out by it, which is just not true.
Okay. We've only got 3 minutes left, so can I bring in Ben in case he wants to ask a question?
Thank you, Lee. Mine is simply an administrative one. I've been frantically tapping away, Catherine, taking minutes of today's fascinating discussion. So on behalf of me and Lee and indeed everybody else, could I thank you so much for your time and all that you've said. I've tried so far as I can in the notes that I've put together to include the most salient and striking points, and I will put them together, I hope, in a comprehensive format for other people to have a look at when we upload them onto our website. So that's what I've been doing throughout the course of this discussion. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing to that, which is we've got some very erudite people around the room, the virtual room here. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming and for your contributions and your questions. I did tell you at the beginning that Catherine was going to step up to any questions that you threw at her. I think we can all agree she's definitely done that, and it's been fascinating. I think this kind of a subject, I think people might be surprised, actually, at how much interest there is in this sort of thing, particularly when it refers to the Anglosphere, as I call it, the Commonwealth, the UK, now that we're free of the EU. And, you know, I'm sure Catherine's got views about that. But, you know, these kinds of conversations have to take place. They honestly do. And you're not gonna get these on the BBC or ITV or Sky News. Today, I think we've heard from Catherine a fascinating range of views from somebody who is integrally involved. And I think we're incredibly lucky to have her. And just before we finish, I want to say a massive thank you to Catherine. She didn't have to do this. It's 2 hours out of her life in what is, at the moment in the UK, an incredibly busy time because of our general election that was called at short notice.
Well, it's a pleasure, Lee. I enjoyed talking to you, and it's my favourite subject, and I'm writing about it now. But I also have to go and predict how bad the carbon border adjustment mechanism will be for the UK economy. It's not looking good. You know.
I think that's a very, very interesting one. One of the topics that is almost never covered in the mainstream media is forget net zero. It's all about the carbon we're importing on an industrial scale. And it's just not being talked about. And it's just blindingly obvious. So,
well, they're talking about it now because they've finally woken up to the big reduction. The UK likes to advertise that they've cut their carbon production by half since 1990. But what they've done is converted their coal-fired power stations to gas, which is great because gas has half the emissions. They've got their methane under control, which was not coming so much from cattle, but coming from landfill. Landfill is the biggest source of methane internationally.
Oh.
And the third thing is they closed down their industry and exported it to China and then said, oh, it's not our emissions, it's their emissions, which is a complete joke. And suddenly Australia, the EU, a lot of countries have woken up and realising that wasn't their cleverest move. But they were just schoolboys playing a game where the game was to get your emissions down, and nobody cared that that was wiping out your industry. I mean, we are run by donkeys, Lee. The more I look at it, the more I think, how do we let these little kids take over the shop, you know?
The lunatics have taken over the asylum. I think probably most of the people around the room would agree with that. So we're out of time. I can't thank you enough, Catherine. It was fascinating hearing your views, and you are involved in government in the UK, so it's important to hear your views. There's so many more things that we could have covered, but we ran out of time for. But you know, just on a positive level, I just want to close on one thing. I love Australia. I love Australians. In fact, when I was a young man, I definitely loved Australians in London, but we're not going to go there. But sticking to the serious, I do have a real affinity with Australia, and so do most Brits. And so do most Brits have a certain embarrassment about the way that we betrayed Australia and other Commonwealth countries when Ted Heath dragged us into the EU without a vote, by the way, in 1972. We only got a vote 3 years later. And nobody really knew what they were voting for, if we're perfectly honest. So exploring these topics and opening up this dialogue to say, do you know what? The United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, to an extent, woke Canada and other countries. If we work together, we could actually create an environment where small state, low tax, high growth, economies, independent sovereign states, become the norm. And if you look what's going on in the EU right now, that's what's happening. And we're going to find out as of tomorrow, because the EU elections start tomorrow. They last for 3 days, believe it or not, but they last for 3 days. But leadership, I think, belongs to the Anglosphere. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this thing. And Catherine, you have not let us down. I found it absolutely fascinating. Hope everybody else did too. I think a round of applause for Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.